It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Belfast and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week.
These low-paid workers can't work longer hours to get back the money the Prime Minister's cutting from them.
Every single recipient of universal credit would lose their benefits under Labour because they want to abolish universal credit.
Welfare, tax rises and the cost of living are back on the agenda at Prime Minister's questions. Nicola Sturgeon says the Scottish Ambulance Service will soon be getting help from the Army.
I recognise that some people are not getting the standard of service that they should be getting.
Our ambulance service is in crisis. We are hearing it day in, day out from people across Scotland.
Could Brexit trade rules bring down the government of Northern Ireland?
Collapsing this institution at this time would be irresponsible, reckless and unforgivable.
It is not that the UK government were not warned about the impact this protocol would have. They were.
And do scenes like this require tougher laws?
On-street assembly and dissent is as much a fundamental freedom as voting in fair and regular elections.
Hello and welcome. Let's start in Westminster, where in the fevered atmosphere of a reshuffle, the party leaders clashed over whether the government's policies were making people richer or poorer. Susan, take us through what's been going on.
Yes, of course, all the excitement about jobs was about ministerial jobs, but actually at Prime Minister's questions, Keir Starmer was interested in jobs at the other end of the income scale, people who are on low pay and on universal credit. Now, you remember that the government brought in a £20 uplift in that's per week in universal credit at the start of the pandemic. It was meant to be temporary. They said it's always meant to be temporary, and it's going from next month onwards. The opposition parties and some Conservative MPs as well are not happy about that, saying people can't cope with it, that times are still tough. And of course, it's a benefit paid not just to people who are unemployed, but to people who are employed. Now, the Work and Pensions Secretary, Therese Coffey, got herself in a bit of a pickle with this at the start of the week because she suggested that to make up that £20, all people needed to do was work another couple of hours. However, that's not the way it works. Because of the way the benefit is set up, you need to work a lot more than that in order to be able to make up £20. And that's what Keir Starmer focused on at Prime Minister's questions and some pretty sparky exchanges.
The Work and Pension Secretary seems to think it's an extra 2 hours a week. So let me make it even easier for the Prime Minister. Is the correct answer higher or lower than that?
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that under this government, for the first time in decades, wages are rising, Mr. Speaker. Wages across the board are rising, and they're 4.1% up on where they were before the pandemic. In fact, I'm very pleased. Of course, what they want to do is to continue to take money in taxation and put it into benefits. We don't think that's the right way, Mr. Speaker. We want to encourage high wages and high skills, Mr. Speaker.
The cost of living is spiralling, and people are being left with a Prime Minister who doesn't know how much his cuts are hitting key workers, and a Secretary of State for Welfare that doesn't know how universal credit works. Mr. Speaker, if any Scottish Tories are in a possession of a backbone, now would be a good time to find it. Does the Prime Minister expect any MPs from his Scottish branch office to stand against the callous cuts to universal credit? Or has the Prime Minister already bought them off with promises of jobs in his reshuffle?
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually what's happening is that we're funding the NHS across the whole of the UK, including in Scotland, I'm proud to say, with record sums. And we've ensured that nurses have access to a training bursary worth £5,000, a further bursary £3,000 for childcare costs, Mr. Speaker, and we have put up, and that is before we put up their pay by 3%.
Now, that was the discussion inside the chamber during PMQs, but of course the debate continued, didn't it? Because Labour then had already announced they were going to hold an opposition day debate on precisely this issue.
That's right, they did. Several hours of debate, and some of those issues were aired again. We did hear some dissent from Conservatives there. Now, there was a vote at the end of that. However, the government say that they do not vote at the end of debates called by the opposition. I think that's kind of a new tradition. They did used to do that, but I think the feeling is that if they don't vote, then that takes a bit of the political heat out of it in case some of their own people rebelled.
Because it is symbolic, really.
It is symbolic. So Labour won the vote, but I'm afraid for those people who wanted the cut not to happen, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't. It still goes ahead. It's a symbolic vote, that's all.
And in terms of the cabinet reshuffle, I mean, it's being completed. The Prime Minister came back to the Commons on Thursday to make an important security announcement.
That's right, yes. We weren't really expecting to see the Prime Minister early on a Thursday morning, but we did with this announcement about an agreement between the UK, the US and Australia to have these nuclear-powered submarines for Australia to patrol the Asia-Pacific. The Prime Minister didn't mention the word China in his original statement, but I think the feeling is that this is really in response to China's ascendancy and a certain amount of belligerence in the area.
Yesterday, I joined President Biden and Prime Minister Morrison to create a new trilateral defence partnership between our countries known as AUKUS, A-U-K-U-S. Australia has for the first time taken the momentous decision to acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, and they've asked for our help in achieving this ambition. I'm delighted to tell the House that we've agreed to this request, and we shall place the UK's expertise in this field amassed over decades at the assistance of our Australian friends. The first task of AUKUS will now be an 18-month trilateral collaboration to determine the best way of delivering advanced nuclear submarines for Australia, emphasising, of course, that they will be powered by nuclear reactors, not armed with nuclear weapons.
The recent events in Afghanistan show us how precarious international stability can be. New challenges can emerge, and issues in faraway corners of the globe can quickly turn into threats at home. So Labour welcomes increased cooperation with our allies.
We must work with, but stand up to China. This is about a more coordinated, long-term strategy in challenging China's increasing hostile dominance in the South China Sea. But as the Prime Minister says, it's also a reminder of how we must work with alliances and rekindle an appetite to robustly defend international standards.
Over the course of the last number of weeks and months, we've all witnessed on the streets of Kabul the devastating consequences of failure where international cooperation falters. Deepening cooperation and advancing agreements with allies that seek to aid stability and security is an important step, especially if past mistakes are never to be repeated, and I welcome this announcement.
Ian Blackford there. And Susan, of course, he's got a new Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, as well as other ministers dealing with foreign affairs.
That's right. It's a very female lineup. He's got Liz Truss as the new Foreign Secretary, Britain's second female Foreign Secretary. Don't forget Margaret Beckett back in the Labour years. And he's also appointed Anne-Marie Trevelyan to Liz Truss's old job in international trade. She actually used to be the Overseas Development Secretary, but her job was abolished when that was merged into the Foreign Office. So here is her reward for having not made too much of a fuss when she had that taken away from her. So it's going to be a very female-facing global Britain.
Right, and another minister who's now since been promoted was in the Commons on Monday with an important announcement for parents and young people.
That's right, Nadeem Zahawi. He was the Vaccines Minister on Monday, and he actually did, I suppose, veer a bit into his new brief because he's the Education Secretary, because he came up with his plan for the vaccination of children aged 12 to 15. Now, this is quite a contentious one. The vaccine for children of that age is rather finely balanced between the risk and the benefit. But it seems that the government has decided that for the children themselves and for the country more widely, given that we're going into the autumn and winter, COVID likely to go up, that everything that can be done to try and keep it at bay is worth doing. So that's going to be rolled out in schools. And he turned up really very late on Monday evening, came as a bit of a surprise to us.
To everyone.
To everyone. So at 9 o'clock in the evening, he came along to announce this.
The unanimous recommendation of the United Kingdom's chief medical officers is to make a universal offer of 1 dose of the Pfizer vaccine to the 12 to 15-year-old age group, with further JCVI guidance needed before any decision on a second dose. They have been clear, Mr. Speaker, they are making this recommendation on the basis of the benefits to children alone and not the benefits to adults or wider society. Mr. Speaker, I can confirm the government has accepted this recommendation, but to those who remain undecided, I want to say this. The MHRA is the best medical regulator in the world, and they have rigorously reviewed the safety of our vaccines. They have concluded they are safe for 12 to 15-year-olds.
We welcome the guidance today from the Chief Medical Officers, and we welcome the response of the government tonight. Children have lost months in in-person learning. Children have spent weeks cut off from friends, cut off from families. We still do not fully understand the long-term mental health implications of this, especially in poorer areas where we know deprivation already has widespread consequences for the health and well-being of our children. And being in school isn't just about learning. Children often access health services through school as well.
But where there's a dispute, we say that the school will make a decision as to whether or not that child has the capacity to make that decision. This is a real problem for us. It will lead to disputes in families and real problems about children's mental health in the opposite direction as they are put under pressure. I wonder if my honourable friend and the government could think again about this, because without serious, clear guidance on this, you will lead to children being in a worse state than they would have been without the vaccine.
And that announcement was part of a wider winter plan dealing with COVID for England that the Health Secretary told MPs about on Tuesday.
Yes, we got double jabbed with COVID statements this week. So we had Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, came along the morning after that statement to talk about what they were going to do more widely to stop the spread of COVID this winter. The main thing is vaccination. That's where it's really different from last September, where we stood on the verge of another wave. There was nothing much they could do about it. They were criticised then for not going harder and faster on, for example, lockdowns. Again, the government is veering between this sort of sense of not wanting to impinge on people's freedoms, but on the other hand, you can't have hospitals overwhelmed and you can't have people dying. So the result of that, I think, is a plan B. He says he will bring in these things, but they're not doing it yet.
Susan, stay with us. We'll come back to you later on in the programme. But for now, let's go to Scotland and talk to our correspondent at Holyrood, Lindsay Bewes. Lindsay, difficulties after the ambulance service is experiencing all sorts of difficulties and ended up all over the front pages.
That's right, yes, and this issue dominated the exchanges at First Minister's questions here at Holyrood. Concerns over the strain on the service had already been raised by Unite, the trade union representing many staff. They had been calling for the army to be brought in, and the head of the ambulance service here in Scotland had apologised to patients for increased waiting times, citing unprecedented pressures caused by a huge increase in COVID and non-COVID cases as well. And there have been lots of reports in the papers and elsewhere of people waiting several hours for an ambulance, including one man who died after a 40-hour wait. Let's take a look at some of the exchanges from FMQs.
our ambulance service is working under acute pressure right now, largely due to COVID. I want to take the opportunity to thank our paramedics and technicians for the work they are doing in such difficult circumstances. While they are responding heroically to these challenges, I recognise that some people are not getting the standard of service that they should be getting, or indeed the standard of service that the Scottish Ambulance Service wants to deliver. That is not acceptable, and I apologise unreservedly to anyone who has suffered or who is suffering unacceptably long waits. A range of actions have already been taken to address these challenges. For example, additional funding to support new recruitment. A number of additional actions are currently under active consideration. I'm happy to summarise these in further exchanges, but I can confirm now that this includes consideration of seeking targeted military assistance to help deal with short-term pressure points. Such military assistance is already being provided to ambulance services in England, and of course we have had military assistance for other aspects of the pandemic over the past 18 months.
First Minister is saying, and I wrote it down, she's not trying to evade the reality. Why will she not then just accept that in Scotland our ambulance service is in crisis? We are hearing it day in, day out from people across Scotland. We are hearing it from the front line, from the paramedics, from the technicians, and we are hearing it from Unite the Union and others. And I'm sorry, but I cannot sit here and listen to the First Minister say that the comments from the Scottish Government's Health Secretary are the same we are hearing elsewhere in the United Kingdom. I have heard no one else in the United Kingdom telling people to think twice before they call an ambulance.
We are in the most challenging set of circumstances that our health service has faced. My job is to make sure we support the service to rise to those challenges, and that's what I will focus on each and every minute of each and every day.
You want to wait a week for a statement and then actions to follow that. You want to consider options about what happens with the British Army. How many more Lillian Briggs need to happen in the next week before we take urgent action? How many more Gerard Browns need to happen in the next week before you take urgent action? Urgent action needs to happen today, tomorrow, the day after, not wait a week for this government to wake up.
The buck always stops with me, and whatever people agree or disagree with me on, I've never tried to shy away from that, and nor will I ever shy away from that. With the greatest respect to Anna Sarwar, government doesn't simply operate when Parliament is sitting. I'll be going back to my office after the session of First Minister's questions to, for example, finalise the detail of the request for military assistance so that we can submit that as quickly as possible. We will be going back to finalise the other additional actions we're taking, which of course are in addition to the actions that have already been taken. Government is literally a 24-hour-a-day responsibility, and we will continue to deal with these things in that manner.
Well, you heard both the Labour and the Tories really pressing the government on what action they're going to take. The focus there was on the Scottish Ambulance Service, but there have been wider concerns raised about how the NHS more broadly is going to cope. That has been a real theme here at Holyrood, given the high numbers of COVID cases that the country has been experiencing in recent weeks.
And Lindsay, the Scottish Government's also been outlining its COVID plan, how it's going to manage the pressures this winter.
That's right, yes. The First Minister gave a COVID update statement this week too. She was talking about extra funding for the NHS and speeding up the recruitment of staff as well. But she also hopes that the expansion of the vaccination programme here in Scotland is going to help curb those COVID cases. The government intends to start that booster programme for the over 50s and other priority groups. And it has also announced plans as well to start the vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds that you were talking about earlier. And the First Minister was outlining to MSPs how consent will work when it comes to vaccinating those children.
It is, of course, important to stress how important informed consent is. I know that many young people and their parents will have questions. Material will be made available online later this week. It will be appropriate to both young people and adults. It will seek to answer questions and provide balanced information to help young people and their parents make informed choices.
It's good to hear that cases are down week on week, but our NHS continues to face considerable pressure. We've seen long waiting times for ambulances and lengthy queues for people to see their GP. Even if the First Minister won't accept it, our NHS is in crisis and our health service needs more support.
Not only do I accept that there is pressure on the National Health Service, I spend a significant, considerable amount of time, as indeed the Health Secretary does, reminding people of just how much pressure there is on the NHS.
Well, you heard Douglas Ross there stressing the need to help the NHS cope with the pressures it's facing. It's an issue the Tories have raised here repeatedly, but what they don't want to see is the reintroduction of any restrictions when it comes to COVID. In fact, they voted against the Scottish Government's plans to bring in a vaccine passport scheme. That is due to start from the 1st of October here in Scotland, where people will need to prove that they have been double vaccinated to get into nightclubs and other large venues. The Tories voted against that. They don't want to see that come into play, but the government does hope that that, alongside the expansion of vaccinations, will help with the high case rates here in Scotland.
Lindsay, there was another potentially controversial debate brought forward by the Scottish Conservatives about the future of oil and gas, specifically the Cambo oil field west of Shetland.
That's right, yes, the Tories used their debating time here to raise that issue. They wanted MSPs to back a motion supporting new oil and gas projects, including that Cambo oil field site. Now, a final decision on whether or not to approve production at that site will be decided on at a UK level, but despite the climate conference due to take place in Scotland this autumn, the Tories were really urging MSPs to back that project, as we heard in the debate.
The industry supports close to 100,000 jobs in Scotland, over 60,000 in the North East. A hard shutdown of the industry consigns that region to a bleak future and ends all the innovations that these workers are already delivering in our transition. We need these skills to pioneer greener energy, to develop carbon capture, hydrogen and offshore wind at scale and rapidly. Losing them will undermine our transition.
Our transition to net zero must be made in a way that is just for the workers, which is key, but also for the sector and for our energy needs. Additionally, this transition also needs to be managed in a way that ensures oil and gas developments are compatible with becoming a net zero society by 2045.
Lindsay, thank you very much for joining us. From Holyrood, we're going to go to the House of Lords, where they've been considering the government's police, crime and sentencing bill. Susan.
Yes, law and order bills often have long names and there's a lot in them as well. They sometimes call them Christmas tree bills because they hang lots of different things on. But probably the most contentious bit of this one is powers for the authorities to curb protests and demos. This is really in response, in particular, to some of those demonstrations we saw from the climate change activists, Extinction Rebellion. You remember they would stop everything happening in some city centres a while back with, you know, dancing and sitting down.
Very colourful.
Gluing themselves to trains, that kind of thing. And again, as you were saying at the beginning of this week, clogging up the M25. So the government says that can't be allowed, it's going too far. Critics say, yeah, but in a democracy, you really can't stop protests, even if they're inconvenient. And what worries them even more is that in this bill, it doesn't really say what about a protest would rule it out of order. And that gives far too much power to the authorities to clamp down on it. But the government is insisting that some kind of curbs on it are needed.
The right to peaceful protest is a fundamental part of our democracy. It is not about stifling freedom of speech and assembly, but about balancing those rights with the rights of others, including protecting the free press and ensuring that people can get to their work and that ambulances can quickly transport patients to hospitals. We've listened to policing professionals who have told us that the distinction made in the Public Order Act between processions and assemblies is out of date and doesn't reflect the operational reality.
Baroness Williams will have seen what the Human Rights Committee of both houses has said in relation to the provisions that have been taken. They say absolutely explicitly that the government has got the balance wrong between the right to protest, the powers being given to the executive to give the executive the power to ban demonstrations because they make excessive noise is not proportionate. You would expect demonstrations to make noise.
Every time I have worked on a bill since I arrived in your Lordship's house nearly 8 years ago, I've always thought this is the worst bill I've ever seen. And you know what? Everyone is, but this is a stinker. And it's quite obviously not going to help the police. If you produce a policing bill and you can't get former police chiefs, the UN Special Rapporteurs, the Joint Committee on Human Rights and the European Centre not-for-profit law on your side, something is wrong with the bill.
Non-violent, I repeat, non-violent, that's what Part 3 is about, on-street assembly and dissent is as much a fundamental freedom, including under the Convention on Human Rights, as voting in fair and regular elections. Indeed, the franchise was not won less than 100 years ago for most ordinary people in this country without a great deal of just the kind of protest that would be criminalised by this bill.
So, Susan, what's happening next with the bill?
Well, it's not over yet. That was just the first debate in the Lords. They then go on to 3 other rounds where they can make changes. There'll be more debates on the detail of the bill. And because the government doesn't have a majority in the House of Lords, they very often get defeated there. And that's a way of asking the government to think again. And sometimes they do.
Right. We're going to go to Belfast in just a moment to hear about what's going on at Stormont. Before we do, though, Susan, Geoffrey Donaldson, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, appeared before a Lords committee this week.
That's right. It all goes back to Brexit and the agreement that Boris Johnson struck with the EU in order not to have a hard border once the UK left between Northern Ireland and the Republic. There was an arrangement whereby a lot of the rules and regulations in Northern Ireland would be the same as the EU. But that meant that there was a bit of a border, certainly checks between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK on goods. That has caused some problems for businesses, and of course the unionists absolutely hate it. And as a result, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has said if they don't fix it, he's faced them with the threat that he will pull the plug on the government in Stormont.
It is not that the UK government were not warned about the impact this protocol would have. They were. Indeed, our concerns were raised in all of the debates around the EU withdrawal agreement and the protocol in terms of the impact creating an Irish sea border would have on our economy and on political stability. And I regret that the UK government pressed ahead with that without seeking the consent of people in Northern Ireland.
Well, let's pick up on what he's been saying with our correspondent at Stormont, Jane McCormack. Welcome to you. Geoffrey Donaldson's not a happy man, is he?
No, he's not, Joe. I think that's an understatement. And obviously, we have seen the warning that he has made about withdrawing his ministers from Stormont. And I think we can expect that really to continue in the weeks ahead, particularly as the UK and EU now try and maybe move ahead to make some real progress on some of the protocol issues. Because the problem is, if they don't, Geoffrey Donaldson has outlined it, he will withdraw his ministers from Stormont. And that has really upped the ante around a lot of instability here at these institutions. And obviously we had MLAs returning from their summer recess back to Stormont this week, and you'll not be surprised to hear that the DUP faced quite a lot of pressure from the other parties about its plan. The First Minister, Paul Givan, was taking his first question time, and he came under scrutiny from his party's power-sharing partner, Sinn Féin.
Political leadership is needed now more than it has ever been. And I have to say, and I believe many people believe, that collapsing this institution at this time would be irresponsible, reckless and unforgivable.
The fundamentals on which the executive is formed has to be right, and that's why there's a window of opportunity now for both the United Kingdom government and the European Union to make sure that the changes that need to be made are made. We will continue to operate these institutions in good faith when it comes to carrying through decisions on whether it's health, education, housing, all of the areas that affect people's lives.
Paul Givan there. Now, Joe, there is essentially a countdown underway because the DUP say it wants tangible progress by changing the protocol by November. Otherwise, that's when it will decide to withdraw its ministers from Stormont, essentially bringing down the power sharing executive here. And obviously, if that does happen, that presents a whole host of problems, which is why we've had the other parties this week saying that they believe that this is all a stunt designed to help the DUP win back hardline unionist voters ahead of the next Assembly election. Now, the DUP, for its part, is saying that that isn't the case and that actually they are really concerned about this issue. But obviously, it's created a lot of friction in an already fragile setup.
Yeah, and you mentioned the problems that could flow from this. If power sharing falls, then so might other important pieces of legislation.
Absolutely, and that is something that other parties have been warning about, because remember, for 3 years we had no government here because of the last collapse of devolution, and that meant that no laws could be made locally. So what's happened now is, since Stormont returned last January, much of the focus has been on dealing with the pandemic. So only now are we starting to see a lot of these delayed bills coming to the Assembly floor. For example, protection from stalking, a bill to bring our organ donation laws in line with the rest of the UK, and even climate change legislation. Now, if Stormont falls, all of them go as well. They're basically back to square one, and that was something not lost on the Justice Minister, Naomi Long, when she brought a bill to the Assembly earlier this week that seeks to strengthen criminal time for those accused of sex offences.
Taken collectively, the provisions in this bill will introduce valuable additional protections for the most vulnerable in our community. While some question the value of devolution, Mr Deputy Speaker, and the worth of this Assembly itself, this legislation is yet more evidence that progress can be delivered when it functions as it should. It is also an example of the opportunities which are forfeited when it does not.
Please, think about what we're doing here. Think about the long term. Think about our children, please, because I do not want this bill to fall because of something we can sort out here as adults and children will suffer.
So, Joe, that is just one piece of legislation that has to get through all of its Assembly stages, either before the next Assembly election was due in May 2022, or before the DUP would decide to withdraw its ministers from Stormont, essentially collapsing power sharing and maybe moving us closer towards an early Assembly election. And we already know how arduous the process of lawmaking here can be. I mean, we are kind of crystal ball gazing a little bit when it comes to the sequencing of how things might go with this potential crisis. The only thing we do know for sure is that if power sharing does fall, then it's over to the Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, to step in and call a fresh election. Now, he doesn't have to move immediately. He could decide to hold off until next May anyway, given that we are kind of facing into the unknown with COVID this winter.
Well, you mentioned COVID. We've talked quite a lot about restrictions and COVID winter plans across the UK. What's happening in Northern Ireland?
So we are still behind the rest of the UK on making more relaxations, and we're even behind the Republic of Ireland because they're due to lift all of their remaining restrictions by October the 22nd. Our death rate and infection rate is still higher than other parts of the UK, which I think has led to a bit more reluctance to make any more relaxations. That being said, the DUP take a slightly different view. The First Minister, Paul Givan, previously said that he wanted all restrictions scrapped here by the end of this month. Now, I don't think that is going to happen. However, when he was at First Minister's Questions earlier this week, he did seem to suggest that when ministers meet next week, it's something that he'll be pushing for.
This executive approach has been one of a cautious approach of reopening, because what nobody wants is to have restrictions brought back in. And we're at a place now where we have reduced the number of areas that restrictions exist in law to a small number, and the executive will be meeting again on the 23rd of this month, where we will be able to take further decisions in respect of those areas that remain.
Jane, thank you. Jane McCormack there at Stormont. It's time to go to Cardiff. We're going to talk to our correspondent there, Dan Davis, where COVID is also on the agenda. Dan.
Yes, this question just won't go away, Joe. If Wales had its own response to the pandemic, why can't it have its own inquiry into the pandemic? The Welsh Government says because so much of what shaped our response to COVID came from London. furlough, vaccines, the advice from Sage, for example. But that's not good enough for the opposition, nor as well a number of campaign groups outside the Senedd, as the First Minister Mark Drakeford was reminded this week by the Welsh Tory leader Andrew R.T. Davies.
It is vitally important that we have an independent inquiry. I pushed you on this before the summer recess. The Senedd had the chance to vote on that, and the governing parties came together and voted that motion down, regrettably. But it is a fact that over the summer recess, the Scottish Government has commissioned an independent inquiry. The UK Government have commissioned an independent inquiry. Organisations such as Asthma UK, British Lung Foundation, Medics for Mask Up Wales, COVID-19 Deceased Families for Justice Cymru have come out asking for this independent inquiry to be commissioned here in Wales. You have the power to do that, First Minister.
We are in the same position as the UK Prime Minister because the independent inquiry that he has announced was announced with the agreement of the Welsh Government and on the basis that the actions that have been taken here in Wales would be independently and fully scrutinised by that inquiry.
Now, after that, Mark Drakeford went on to quote from a letter he'd written to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. That's the old pre-reshuffle occupant of that job, Michael Gove, saying that if the Welsh Government wasn't happy with the assurances, the terms of reference, the methodology and the membership of this inquiry, then it may think again. So the implication that you draw from that, Joe, is that Wales may get its own inquiry after all.
Well, Dan, Labour have been talking to Plaid Cymru, haven't they, about power sharing?
Yes, they have. And after those robust, lively exchanges with Andrew R.T. Davies, it was the turn of the Plaid Cymru leader, Adam Price, who also agrees that the Welsh Government is ducking its responsibility on the inquiry. But he didn't want to talk about that. Instead, he talked about things that he agreed with the First Minister, including the benefit system or the need for reform of it, the deficiencies of devolution as they see it, and also a Welsh Government pilot into UBI or Universal Basic Income.
That the solutions to Wales's problems will never come from Westminster is, for many of us, a foundational truth of Welsh democracy. That's true of the problems that are unique to Wales, but also to the global problems to which Wales is not immune, but which we can make possibly our own unique contribution to solving. In that context, it's inspiring to see the momentum growing behind exciting, pioneering ideas like the UBI pilot.
First of all, I absolutely agree that one of the huge advantages of devolution is that it allows for experimentation, that it allows for policy ideas to be tried out, for radical ideas to be given a practical opportunity to demonstrate what they can achieve. And I definitely want this term and this government to be part of that living laboratory of devolution.
Now, that was all very cordial, and no wonder, because about an hour later we were told, pretty much out of the blue, that Plaid Cymru and Labour had been in talks in private for quite a while on some sort of agreement that would shore up the Welsh Government. Labour doesn't have an outright majority here. It won half the seats in May's Senedd election, which of course means a lot of horse trading and haggling for Mark Drakeford. So to avoid all of that, he and Plaid Cymru have been talking about the policies that they agree on and could cooperate on. Should stress this isn't going to lead to some sort of coalition with Plaid members in the cabinet. It'll still be a Labour government, but it will mean some sort of compromise inevitably. In exchange for that, Mark Drakeford would hope he'll find it a bit easier to get key pieces of legislation and, of course, the budget passed in the Senedd over the next couple of years at least.
And what about how the Welsh Government then will handle COVID this winter?
Yeah, well, it's 7 weeks since restrictions were lifted in Wales and 7 weeks in which COVID cases, by and large, have gone up and up. And the Health Minister, Eluned Morgan, told us this week they expect that to continue for the current the current wave of infections to peak round about the end of the month. The Welsh Government relies on modelling from some very clever people at Swansea University to anticipate what will happen next. And in a statement this week, the Health Minister said that modelling shows that hospital cases are also going to continue to rise until the end of September.
Dan,
at the moment, there are around 40 COVID-19 hospital admissions a day. There are just over 480 confirmed cases in hospitals across Wales, the highest number since March. Now, our modelling suggests there could be 100 new COVID-19 hospital admissions every day as the Delta wave peaks. The NHS is already under intense pressure as it responds to emergency healthcare demands and provides more planned operations and treatment. And our health and care services are already experiencing staffing pressures through a combination of annual leave, staff working in other areas, sickness and isolation. Our health and care staff are exhausted after working so hard and so intensely over the last 18 months.
That's it from the Senedd in Cardiff. Thank you to Dan Davis there. Let's return to Westminster, Susan, where there was a debate to mark Black Maternal Health Week.
Yes, and there were some shocking statistics in that debate about the higher rates of complications and even deaths of black mothers and their babies. Nobody really knows why. The government's doing a bit of work to look into the inequalities and why that's happening. This was a debate that took place in what's called Westminster Hall, which is a sort of satellite debating chamber of the Commons, where sometimes these more personal debates happen. I must say, when I first started watching Parliament, you would not have got these kinds of debates at all, I don't think. And it does show the much more diverse backgrounds of MPs today, because some of them spoke about their own experiences. Bel Ribeiro-Addy, who led the debate, has talked before about her own experience of losing a baby, as did other MPs in the debate.
Members will by now be very familiar with the statistics surrounding black maternal health care and mortality, but they bear repeating because in the UK, which is one of the safest countries in the world to give birth, black women are still 4 times more likely to die in pregnancy or childbirth. Black women are up to 83% more likely to suffer a near miss during pregnancy. Black babies have a 121% increased risk for stillbirth and a 50% increased risk of neonatal death. Miscarriage rates are 40% higher in black women, and black ethnicity is regarded as a risk factor for miscarriage. Black mothers are twice as likely to give birth before 37 weeks of pregnancy.
That panic, that fear, that unknown, the fact that my husband hadn't been contacted yet, they hadn't been able to locate him, the fact that my body froze and my body rejected the epidural, and hearing the words of the doctor say that I would have to go under general anaesthetic. And I said, what? I'm going to be put to sleep and you're going to deliver this baby. What if I don't wake up? And I was lucky because I did wake up after many hours. But for a number of black women, they're not as lucky. They don't wake up.
We have established, and it launches on the 1st of October, the newly formed Office for Health Improvement and Disparities, to work to target those health disparities, including racial and ethnic disparities in health, and to improve preconception health to support women to be their best health throughout pregnancy.
Nadine Dorries there, ending that very moving debate with some very personal stories of female MPs in the House of Commons. Nadine Dorries, of course, is now no longer a health minister, but has in fact become the culture secretary. Susan, what will MPs be debating next week?
Well, next week's the last week before they go off for their conferences, where they have all their get-togethers in towns and cities around the country. And it's quite a light week by the looks of it at the moment. We've still got Prime Minister's questions. But of course, as ever, the issue is what comes up. It's those statements, what's called an urgent question that you're not expecting, that we're looking out for.
Susan, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for. I'll be back on Monday at 12:15 with Politics Live, and next Friday, of course, with Politics UK.